In an upscale restaurant filled with power and money, a single father working as a waiter spilled a few drops of water. The billionaire at the table didn't just complain. He humiliated the man in front of international guests, calling him uneducated, a failure, unfit to raise a child. He said the daughter would grow up just as worthless. But then the waiter lifted his head. He didn't beg. He responded in flawless English, then German, then Mandarin, each word precise, cold, unshakable. And in his eyes, something made the entire room go silent. What is a man dismissed as nothing actually hiding? Ethan Parker had been working at the Golden Meridian for 2 years. He kept his head down, spoke only when necessary, and never complained. The other servers knew very little about him. They knew he had a daughter. They knew he always took the evening shifts so he could walk her to school in the mornings. They knew he wore the same uniform, carefully mended at the sleeves, and that he sometimes wrapped leftover bread in napkins to take home. But they didn't know where he came from. They didn't know what he did before. And Ethan preferred it that way. He was 34 years old, lean and quiet, with dark hair that was starting to gray at the temples. He moved through the dining room like a shadow, refilling glasses, clearing plates, always one step ahead of what the guests needed. He never made mistakes. He never drew attention. The Golden Meridian was not just a restaurant. It was a stage. The people who came here didn't just eat. They came to be seen, to make impressions, to remind each other of their place in the world. The dining room glowed with soft amber light. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. The walls were lined with dark wood and gold trim. Every table was set with china that cost more than Ethan made in a month. Most nights, he barely noticed the guests. He had trained himself not to look too closely, not to listen too carefully. It was easier that way. Safer. But tonight was different. Victor Hale had reserved the largest private table in the corner. Ethan had seen him before. Everyone had. Victor was 50 years old, broad-shouldered and loud, with silver hair slicked back and a watch that caught the light every time he moved his wrist. He was a real estate billionaire, the kind of man who believed his money proved something about his character. He had come from nothing, people said. He built his empire from the ground up, and now he treated anyone who still worked with their hands as if they had failed some essential test of willpower. Victor had a habit of snapping his fingers to call servers over. He didn't look at their faces when he spoke. He left tips that were insultingly small compared to the price of his meals. The staff hated him, but they smiled and nodded, because Victor Hale was a VIP. Tonight, he had brought a group of international guests. Ethan could hear them speaking as he passed the table. English, German, Mandarin. They were investors, consultants, people Victor wanted to impress. He was standing at the head of the table, gesturing broadly, telling a story about a deal he had closed in Dubai. Ethan wasn't supposed to be working this section. He was covering for another server who had called in sick at the last minute. He carried a tray of water glasses, moving carefully between the tables. The dining room was crowded. Every table was full. The air smelled like roasted lamb and expensive wine. As Ethan approached Victor's table, the billionaire stood up suddenly, turning to greet someone across the room. His arm swung wide. It caught the edge of Ethan's tray. Water splashed across Victor's vest. For a moment, no one moved. Victor looked down at the dark stain spreading across the fabric. Then he looked up at Ethan. His expression didn't change. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He smiled. It was the worst kind of smile. Cold. Amused. Like he had just been handed an opportunity. Ethan set the tray down immediately. He pulled a cloth napkin from his apron and held it out. "I'm very sorry, sir. Let me help." Victor waved him off, still smiling. He turned to his guests, shaking his head. It's fine. Accidents happen, right? Especially when you're new at something." One of the guests, a middle-aged man with glasses, glanced at Ethan and then back at Victor. He seemed uncomfortable. "Victor, it's not a big deal. It was an accident." Victor ignored him. He kept his eyes on Ethan, his voice light, almost cheerful. "How long have you been doing this? Waiting tables, I mean. You've been here a while, haven't you?" Ethan gave a brief nod. His throat felt tight. 2 years, sir." Victor raised his eyebrows as if surprised. 2 years, huh? And before that? Ethan didn't answer. Victor turned back to the table, spreading his hands in a gesture of mock sympathy. "See, this is what I'm talking about. You meet people like this all the time. Good people, I'm sure. But no ambition. No drive. They do the same thing, day after day, year after year, and they wonder why nothing changes." One of the women at the table, Asian American with sharp eyes and expensive jewelry, frowned slightly. She didn't say anything. Victor wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, studying Ethan with that same cold smile. "Let me guess. You didn't go to college, did you? Or maybe you did, but you didn't finish. And now you're here, pouring water for people who actually made something of themselves." Ethan felt heat rising in his chest. He kept his face blank. He had learned how to do that, how to stand still and take it, how to let the words slide off without showing anything. "I'm very sorry for the inconvenience, sir. I'll get you a fresh napkin." Victor waved his hand dismissively. "Forget the napkin. I'm just trying to help you understand something. You want to know why you're standing here and I'm sitting there? It's because I made different choices. I worked hard. I educated myself. I took risks. And you? Well, you probably have kids, right? Trying to support a family on tips." Ethan's hands tightened on the cloth napkin. Victor saw it. His smile widened. "I'm right, aren't I? You've got a kid at home, and they're going to grow up just like you, because that's how it works. People don't rise above their station. They just repeat the same patterns." The woman at the table leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. "Victor, that's enough." Victor glanced at her, irritated. "I'm just being honest, Helen. The world doesn't change because we pretend everyone's equal. Some people are built for success. Some people aren't. And that's not cruel. That's just reality." The German man with glasses shook his head. "This is unnecessary." Victor laughed, turning back to Ethan. "You see? My friends here think I'm being too harsh. But I bet you agree with me, don't you? Deep down, you know I'm right. You know your kid is going to end up in the same place you are, working some dead-end job, wondering where it all went wrong." Something shifted in Ethan's chest. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was colder than that. Sharper. He thought about the morning. He had woken up early, like always, and made breakfast for his daughter. Scrambled eggs and toast. She had been drawing at the kitchen table, her tongue sticking out in concentration. She was 7 years old, with her mother's eyes and her mother's laugh. Before he left for work, she had handed him the drawing. It was a picture of a man holding a little girl's hand. Underneath, in wobbly letters, she had written, "Daddy is my hero." Ethan had folded the drawing carefully and tucked it into his wallet. It was still there now, pressed against the few bills he had left. He studied Victor Hale. He studied the man's expensive suit, his smug smile, his gold watch. He glanced at the guests around the table, some of them embarrassed, some of them just watching. Ethan could walk away right now. He could apologize again, bow his head, and disappear into the back of the restaurant. He could keep his job. He could keep his daughter safe. But then he thought about what she had asked him last week. "Daddy, why did Emma's mom say I won't be successful because I don't have a mommy?" He had held her close, stroking her hair. You don't need anyone to tell you who you are, sweetheart. You just need to know it yourself. Ethan lifted his head. He met Victor Hale's eyes directly. I apologize for spilling the water, Mr. Hale, but I don't apologize for my daughter. Victor blinked. What? Ethan's voice was steady, calm. You just said my daughter is going to fail, but you don't know anything about her. You don't know she's learning 2 languages at school. You don't know she reads every night before bed. You don't know she draws pictures for me when she sees I'm tired. The dining room had gone quiet. Other guests at nearby tables were starting to notice. Victor's smile faded. His expression hardened. Oh, so you're a great father, is that it? And what are you teaching her? How to scrape by, how to settle for less. Ethan didn't flinch. I'm teaching her that dignity doesn't come from how much money you have. It comes from how you treat people when no one is watching. The words came out in perfect, crisp English, not the flat, careful English of someone who learned it as a second language, the kind of English that came from years of education, from confidence, from something Victor hadn't expected. Victor stared at him. The German man at the table sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing. The woman, Helen, whispered something in Mandarin to the person next to her. This man is not simple. Ethan turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze. He responded in fluent Mandarin, his tone polite but firm. I understand what you just said, ma'am. You're right. I'm not simple. The woman's eyes widened. The German man leaned forward, speaking in German with a puzzled voice. Who are you, really? Ethan answered him in German, equally fluent and precise. Someone who forgot who he was, but not anymore. Victor Hale sat frozen in his chair, his mouth slightly open. The entire restaurant was watching now. The silence in the dining room felt thick, almost solid. Ethan could hear the soft clink of silverware from somewhere far away, the muted hum of conversation from tables that hadn't yet noticed what was happening. But at Victor Hale's table, no one moved. The German man leaned forward, his elbows on the table. He spoke carefully, his accent precise. You speak German. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of disbelief. Ethan gave a single nod. He kept his voice level, professional. I do. Helen, the woman who had whispered in Mandarin, was staring at him with an expression that had shifted from surprise to something sharper. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. Where did you learn? Ethan met her gaze. Geneva. I worked there for several years. Victor Hale found his voice. It came out tight, strained. You're lying. Ethan didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was, sitting right there in the open, and everyone at the table could see it. Victor pushed his chair back and stood up. His face had flushed red, the veins in his neck standing out. He pointed a finger at Ethan, his hand shaking slightly. You think you're clever? You think speaking a few languages makes you special? You're still just a waiter. You're still a failure. If you were actually good at anything, you wouldn't be standing here in that ridiculous uniform, cleaning up after people like me. Ethan didn't move. He felt the weight of every eye in the restaurant on him now. The other servers had stopped what they were doing. Some of them stood near the kitchen door, watching. The manager was at the far end of the room, his expression tight with worry. Ethan knew what was coming. He had known the moment he opened his mouth. There was no walking this back, no apologizing his way out of it. But something had shifted inside him when Victor mentioned his daughter. Something that had been buried for 3 years had cracked open, and now there was no closing it again. He spoke quietly, but his voice carried. You're right, Mr. Hale. I did have opportunities. I worked as an interpreter for international organizations. I had an office. I had business cards with my name printed on them. I had a career. Victor's expression twisted into something ugly, triumphant. So what happened? You screwed it up, didn't you? Couldn't handle the pressure? Ethan shook his head slowly. 3 years ago, my wife died in a car accident. My daughter was 4 years old, and I had to choose. I could keep the career, keep traveling, keep working late nights and weekends, or I could come home, be there when she woke up, be there when she went to sleep. The German man was watching him closely now. Helen had gone very still. Ethan continued, his voice steady. So I left Geneva. I moved back here. I took the first job I could find that would let me have mornings with my daughter. And if that's failure by your definition, Mr. Hale, then I'm proud to be a failure. Victor's complexion had deepened to almost purple. He slammed his hand down on the table, making the glasses jump. You're pathetic. You gave up. You ran away. And now you're trying to make it sound noble. Helen stood up. Her voice was sharp, cutting through Victor's anger. Victor, stop! He whirled on her. Stay out of this, Helen. This doesn't concern you. She didn't sit back down. Instead, she focused on Ethan, her expression thoughtful. You said you worked in Geneva. For whom? Ethan hesitated. He hadn't spoken about this in 3 years. He had buried it, along with everything else from that life. But now, standing here in the middle of the Golden Meridian, with his job already lost and nothing left to protect, the words came easily. UNESCO, and before that, the International Red Cross. I was a conference interpreter, simultaneous translation for high-level meetings. The German man let out a low whistle. He glanced at Victor, then back at Ethan. That's not easy work. Ethan shrugged slightly. It paid well. It was challenging. But it required me to be away from home most of the time. And after my wife died, that wasn't an option anymore. Victor was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling. He jabbed his finger toward Ethan again. So you threw it all away? For what? To raise a kid who's going to end up just like you? Working dead-end jobs? Going nowhere? Something cold settled over Ethan. He had been calm until now, controlled. But Victor had crossed a line he didn't know existed. Ethan took a step closer to the table. His voice dropped, but it didn't lose any of its strength. My daughter reads at a 3rd grade level. She's 7. She's learning Spanish and French at school. She writes stories. She draws. She asks questions about everything. And she's kind. She's the kind of person who notices when someone is sad and tries to make them feel better. He stared directly at Victor, and there was something in his eyes that made the billionaire take a half step back. You have money, Mr. Hale. You have power. But you don't have anyone who loves you for who you really are. You don't have anyone who draws you pictures when you're tired. You don't have anyone waiting for you at home who's just happy you exist. The words landed like stones in water. The ripples spread out across the table, across the room. Victor's mouth opened and closed. For the first time all night, he had nothing to say. The German man cleared his throat. He was observing Ethan with something that might have been respect. What's your name? Ethan glanced at him. Ethan Parker. The man inclined his head. I'm Marcus Weber. I run the UNESCO regional office here. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Recognition, maybe, or just the strange sensation of 2 parts of his life colliding after years of keeping them separate. Marcus gestured to the empty chair at the table. Sit down for a moment. Victor exploded. Absolutely not. He's staff. He doesn't sit with guests. Marcus ignored him. He kept his eyes on Ethan. Please. Ethan glanced at the manager, who was still standing frozen near the back of the room. The man's expression was pale. He gave a tiny shake of his head. A warning. But Ethan was past warnings now. He pulled out the chair and sat down. Victor's hands clenched into fists. He turned to the manager, his voice loud enough to carry across the entire restaurant. Fire him. Right now. Or I walk out of here and I never come back, and I'll make sure everyone I know does the same." The manager moved forward, his steps hesitant. He was a thin man in his 50s, with gray hair and tired eyes. He had always been kind to Ethan, in a distant, professional way. But kindness didn't pay the bills. Kindness didn't keep the restaurant in business. "Mr. Parker, I think you should step outside." Ethan stood up slowly. He turned to Marcus, then to Helen, then to the other guests who were still watching in silence. "I apologize for the disruption." Marcus raised a hand. "You have nothing to apologize for." Victor was shaking with rage. He pointed at the manager. "I want him gone. I want him blacklisted. I want to make sure he never works in this city again." The manager gave a reluctant nod, his expression miserable. "Mr. Parker, we'll need to discuss your employment. Please wait in the back." Ethan turned to leave, but before he could take more than a few steps, Helen spoke up. Her voice was calm, measured. "Victor, I'm withdrawing from the project." Victor spun around to face her. "What?" She was already gathering her things, sliding her phone into her purse. "I don't work with people who treat others this way. I don't care how much money is involved." Victor's complexion went white. "You can't be serious. We've been planning this for months." Helen stood up, smoothing her dress. She regarded Ethan, and there was something like approval in her eyes. "I'm very serious. Good luck with your deal, Victor. I hope it's worth it." She walked past Ethan, giving him a small nod as she went. The sound of her heels on the marble floor was the only noise in the room. Marcus was watching Victor now, his expression unreadable. He folded his napkin carefully and placed it on the table. "I think I'm going to step outside as well. I need some air." Victor grabbed his arm. "Marcus, don't do this. Don't let this buddy ruin everything." Marcus pulled his arm free. He didn't raise his voice, but his words were sharp. "That nobody just showed more dignity and strength than you've shown all evening. I came here tonight because I thought you were someone worth knowing. I was wrong." He stood up and walked toward the door, stopping briefly next to Ethan. "Wait outside for me. I'd like to speak with you." Ethan managed a nod, too stunned to say anything. Victor was left standing alone at the table. The other guests, the ones who hadn't spoken, were studying anything but him. One by one, they began making excuses. They had early meetings. They needed to make phone calls. They had somewhere else to be. Within 5 minutes, the table was empty except for Victor. The manager approached Ethan, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I have no choice. You're terminated effective immediately." Ethan had known it was coming, but hearing the words still felt like a punch to the chest. He thought about the rent due in 2 weeks. He thought about Lily's school fees. He thought about the careful budget he kept on a piece of paper taped to the refrigerator at home, every dollar accounted for. But then he thought about what he would tell Lily when she asked him about his day, and he realized he would rather tell her he lost his job standing up for her than tell her he kept it by staying silent. "I understand." The manager's expression was pained. "You're a good worker, Ethan. I wish things were different." Ethan acknowledged this with a brief nod. He untied his apron and handed it over. Then he walked toward the exit, past the tables of people who were already going back to their meals, past the other servers who watched him with a mixture of sympathy and fear. Victor was still standing at his empty table. He was staring at nothing, his hands hanging at his sides. For just a moment, Ethan almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The night air outside was cold. Ethan stood on the sidewalk, his hands in his pockets. He had no coat. He had left it in his locker inside, and he wasn't about to go back for it now. His phone buzzed. A text from his neighbor, the older woman who watched Lily on the evenings he worked late. "Lily's asking when you'll be home. Should I tell her you'll be late?" Ethan stared at the message. He stared at the photo attached to it. Lily sitting at the kitchen table with a book open in front of her, smiling at the camera. He started to type a response, but his hands were shaking. Not from the cold, from everything that had just happened, from the weight of it all crashing down at once. He sat down on the curb, his head in his hands. For the first time in 3 years, since the funeral, since the day he had to explain to a 4-year-old girl why her mother wasn't coming home, Ethan cried. He cried quietly, his shoulders shaking, trying to keep it together, but failing. He wasn't crying because he lost his job. He was crying because he was terrified. Terrified that he had made the wrong choice. Terrified that standing up for his daughter meant he wouldn't be able to take care of her. Terrified that Victor Hale was right, and he really was just a failure dragging his child down with him. The door to the restaurant opened behind him. Footsteps approached. Marcus Weber stood there, his coat folded over one arm. He studied Ethan, and his expression was kind. "Are you all right?" Ethan wiped his eyes quickly, trying to pull himself together. "I'm fine." Marcus sat down on the curb next to him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus said quietly, "I lost my wife 8 years ago. Cancer. I had 2 sons. They were 10 and 12 at the time." Ethan turned to him. Marcus was staring straight ahead, his voice distant. "I kept working. I told myself they needed stability, routine. But what they really needed was me. And I wasn't there. I was traveling, taking meetings, building a career. By the time I realized what I'd lost, they were grown and we barely knew each other anymore." He turned to Ethan. "What you did in there, what you chose 3 years ago, that takes more courage than anything I've ever done." Ethan didn't know what to say. He sat there on the cold curb, trying to process Marcus's words, trying to understand why this stranger was telling him something so personal. Marcus reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card. He held it out. "We're starting a new translation program, regional conferences, diplomatic meetings. We need interpreters who understand what it means to have something worth protecting." Ethan took the card slowly. The paper felt heavy in his hand. "I just lost my job. I'm not exactly a great hire right now." Marcus smiled, but it was sad around the edges. "You lost your job because you refused to let a bully humiliate you in front of your daughter's memory. That tells me more about your character than any resume ever could." The door opened again. Helen stepped out, pulling her coat tighter against the wind. She spotted them and walked over, her heels clicking on the pavement. "There you are. I was hoping I'd catch you before you left." She studied Ethan with an expression that was difficult to read. Measuring, maybe. Considering. "I run an educational foundation. We're launching a bilingual learning program for children from low-income families. We need people who understand what it's like to struggle, who know what those kids are facing." She pulled out her own card and handed it to Ethan. "We also need families willing to be part of our promotional materials. Real families, not actors pretending to care about education. I think you and your daughter would be perfect." Ethan stared at the 2 cards in his hand. An hour ago, he had been worried about losing his job. Now he was sitting on a sidewalk, holding 2 job offers from people he had just met. "I don't understand. Why are you doing this?" Helen crouched down so she was at eye level with him. Her voice was firm but not unkind. "Because what you said in there was true. Dignity doesn't come from money. It comes from how you treat people when it doesn't benefit you to be kind. You could have walked away. You could have let Victor say whatever he wanted. But you didn't. You stood up. Not for yourself. For your daughter." She straightened up, brushing off her dress. "That's the kind of person I want working with vulnerable children. Someone who understands what's actually important." Marcus acknowledged this with agreement. He stood up as well, offering his hand to help Ethan to his feet. "Think about it. Both offers. No pressure. But I hope you'll call." Ethan stood, his legs unsteady. He slipped the cards into his pocket. Thank you. I don't know what to say. Marcus clapped him gently on the shoulder. Say you'll go home to your daughter. She's probably waiting for you. Helen was already walking toward a sleek black car parked at the curb. She turned back before getting in. And Ethan, don't let people like Victor Hale make you forget who you are. The world has enough people with money. It needs more people with courage. They both left. The street grew quiet again. Ethan stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. His phone buzzed again. Another text from his neighbor. She's getting sleepy. Want me to put her to bed? Ethan typed back quickly. No. I'm coming home now. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He started walking toward the bus stop. He didn't have money for a cab, and it would take 3 buses to get home, but he didn't care. He needed the time to think, to figure out what he was going to tell Lily. Behind him, through the tall windows of the Golden Meridian, he could still see Victor Hale. The man was sitting alone at his table now. The servers were clearing away the unused place settings, the abandoned wine glasses. Victor had his phone pressed to his ear, but even from outside, Ethan could see the frustration on his expression. Ethan thought about what Marcus had said, about courage, about what it meant to choose the people you loved over the things you wanted. He thought about his wife, about the last conversation they'd had before the accident. She had been tired, worried about money, but she had smiled at him and said, "As long as we have each other, we have everything that matters." And then she was gone. And Ethan had to figure out how to be enough for both of them, how to be a mother and a father, a provider and a caretaker, strong and gentle at the same time. He had failed at a lot of things in the past 3 years. He had burned dinners and forgotten permission slips and shown up to school events wearing his work uniform because he didn't have time to change. But he had never failed to show up. He had never failed to be there. The bus arrived, half empty. Ethan climbed on and found a seat near the back. The city rolled past the window, streetlights and storefronts, and people hurrying home to their own lives. By the time he reached his apartment building, it was almost midnight. The hallways were quiet. His neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, a woman in her 70s who had lived in the building for 40 years, opened her door as soon as she heard his footsteps. "She's asleep on my couch. Tried to wait up for you, but couldn't quite make it." Ethan stepped inside. Lily was curled up under a blanket, her small face peaceful. She had one hand tucked under her cheek, the other clutching a stuffed rabbit that had been her mother's. Mrs. Thompson watched him with knowing eyes. "Rough night?" Ethan almost laughed. It came out as more of a sigh. "You could say that." She patted his arm. "Whatever it is, it'll work out. You're a good father. That's worth more than most people realize." He carefully lifted Lily into his arms. She stirred slightly, mumbling something he couldn't quite hear, but didn't wake up. He carried her across the hall to their apartment, thanking Mrs. Thompson quietly before closing the door. Their apartment was small. 1 bedroom for Lily, a pull-out couch in the living room for him. The kitchen was barely big enough for 2 people to stand in, but it was clean. It was warm, and every wall was covered with Lily's artwork. He laid her down in her bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. She rolled over, still sleeping, and he noticed a piece of paper on her nightstand. It was another drawing, a man standing in front of a crowd, and on his chest, someone had drawn a cape, a superhero cape. Underneath, in Lily's careful handwriting, "Daddy, I drew this for you today. You are my superhero. Love, Lily." Ethan sat down on the edge of the bed. He picked up the drawing, holding it carefully. The paper crinkled slightly in his hands. He had spent 3 years trying to be invisible, trying to keep his head down, to avoid attention, to just get through each day without causing problems. He had convinced himself that safety meant silence, that protecting his daughter meant never making waves. But tonight, He had made waves. He had stood up. He had spoken. And instead of drowning, he had found out there were people willing to throw him a lifeline. He folded the drawing and slipped it into his wallet, next to the one she had given him that morning. Then he leaned down and kissed her forehead. "We're going to be okay, sweetheart," he whispered. "I promise." He left her door cracked open, the way she liked it, and walked back to the living room. He pulled out the 2 business cards and set them on the small kitchen table. He stared at them for a long time. Then he pulled out his phone and typed a careful email to Marcus Weber. He introduced himself properly. He explained his experience, his qualifications, his availability. He tried to sound professional, confident, like someone worth hiring. He did the same for Helen. He told her about Lily, about her love of learning, about the way she approached the world with curiosity and kindness. He hit send on both emails before he could second-guess himself. Then he sat back and waited. Across the city, in a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that cost more than most people made in a year, Victor Hale sat alone. His phone was on the table in front of him. He had sent a dozen messages, trying to salvage the deals that had fallen apart tonight, trying to explain what had happened, trying to convince people to give him another chance. No one was responding. He poured himself a drink, then another. The silence in the apartment was suffocating. He had paid millions of dollars for this view, for this space, for the prestige of living here. But tonight it felt empty. He thought about what that waiter had said, about having people who loved you for who you really were, about having someone waiting at home who was just happy you existed. Victor couldn't remember the last time someone had been happy to see him, not because of what he could do for them, not because of his money or his connections, just because of who he was. He finished his drink and stared out at the city below, thousands of lights, thousands of lives, and he was alone in the middle of all of it. His phone buzzed, an email. He opened it, hoping it was one of the investors finally responding. It was from Marcus Weber. The message was short. "Victor, after tonight's events, I'm formally withdrawing UNESCO's support from your development project. We cannot associate with someone who treats people the way you treated that young man. I hope you take this as an opportunity to reflect on what truly matters. Marcus." Victor read it 3 times. Then he set the phone down and put his head in his hands. For the first time in a very long time, he wondered if he had made a mistake, not just tonight, but in everything, in every choice that had brought him to this moment. He wondered what it would feel like to have a daughter who drew pictures of him, to have someone regard him the way that waiter had when he talked about his child. He wondered when exactly he had stopped being a person and started being just a collection of bank accounts and business deals. But he didn't know how to find his way back. He didn't even know if there was a way back. So he sat there in his expensive apartment, surrounded by everything he had worked for, and felt nothing but empty. The next morning, Ethan woke to the smell of burnt toast. He sat up on the pull-out couch, disoriented for a moment. Then he heard the sound of humming from the kitchen. Lily was standing on a chair, trying to scrape the blackened bread into the trash. She turned when she heard him move, her face lighting up. "I tried to make you breakfast, Daddy." "But the toaster is mean." Ethan got up and walked over, wrapping his arms around her. "That's okay, sweetheart. The thought counts." She hugged him back, then pulled away to study his face. "You look tired. Did you work really late?" Ethan thought about everything that had happened, the humiliation, the confrontation, the moment he had finally stopped hiding, the business cards sitting on the table. "Yeah, I did. But it was a good night." Lily beamed. "Did you see my drawing? The one with the cape?" He nodded, his throat tight. "I did. It's beautiful. Thank you." She climbed down from the chair and took his hand. Mrs. Thompson said you're a hero. She said not all heroes wear capes, but you should have one anyway, because you're brave. Ethan crouched down so he was at her level. You know what makes someone brave, Lily. It's not being strong or powerful. It's choosing to do the right thing, even when it's scary. She thought about this for a moment, then nodded seriously. Like when I told Emma's mom that she was wrong about me. Ethan felt his heart swell. Exactly like that. I'm so proud of you. His phone buzzed. An email notification. He pulled it out and opened it. It was from Marcus Weber. Ethan, I'd like to meet with you this week to discuss the position. Would Tuesday morning work? We can talk details over coffee. Looking forward to it. Marcus. Another email came in immediately after. From Helen. Mr. Parker, I showed my team your background and we're all very impressed. We'd love to have you on board. Can you come by our office Wednesday afternoon? And please bring Lily if you can. We'd love to meet her. Best, Helen. Ethan stared at his phone. Then he looked at his daughter, who was watching him with curious eyes. Daddy, are you okay? He smiled. A real smile. The first one in a very long time. Yes, sweetheart. I think we're going to be more than okay. He picked her up and spun her around, and her laughter filled the small apartment. Outside, the city was waking up. People were heading to work, starting their days, living their lives. And for the first time in 3 years, Ethan Parker felt like he was finally waking up too.